everyone, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 1st of June, where I wanted to continue our conversations about Frankenstein. And you'll see in the notes below that your first journal is supposed to be due today, which is Thursday, if you are watching this video on Thursday the 1st, by 11:59 p.m. via PDF, please, because that's how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And then I can review those and get those back to you. Some of you have already submitted in those journals. Thank you very much. I'll be getting them back to you shortly. I'm evaluating them, not for grammar or mechanics, but for content, a kind of conversation on paper. I'm thinking about a page or so of reflections or thoughts, but certainly you can do as much or as little as you'd like. And my evaluation is an informal checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory. There also is a less than satisfactory and an unsatisfactory. And the idea behind the journals is that you can put your questions. Sometimes the questions are a lot more important than the answers, actually. Thoughts, reflections. You can certainly make commentary about topics that we've discussed in class discussion forums or elements that I've discussed in the class videos. As you know, the summer session is very condensed, so I wanted to give you a little bit of extra time if you so needed it and wanted it for that journal. So you have up until Tuesday, actually, the 6th at 11:59 p.m. So that said, if you can't get it in by Tuesday, the 6th by 11:59 p.m., then do talk with me and we can talk about extensions. But I'm hopeful that at this point you have either concluded reading Frankenstein or you are close to concluding reading Frankenstein. As you know, that we are going to be, in addition to writing journals, writing formal academic papers that I will be talking more in depth about as the semester progresses. But if you were to go to our syllabus and other documents folder, you will see that I had included a handout of suggested paper topics. And these topics are just that, suggested. You're not required to follow any of them, and they are so broad that you would really need to develop them into a specific thesis. And certainly you can combine and adapt, but I encourage you to come up with your own topics as well. And the journals might be a place where you can examine some of the possible ideas that you might have for a paper. And certainly if when I'm reading your journals I see something that occurs to me that could be suitable for a paper, I'll let you know. That said, that doesn't necessarily mean that if I don't highlight something in your journal that it's not suitable, but if something just jumps out at me, I would let you know. And I wanted to just review this handout with you about paper topics, again, because the sooner you start thinking about it, the better off you are, because the summer session is so condensed. And your first paper is due approximately midway through our semester, and this is the paper that you have the option to revise for a higher grade if you so elect. I just ask that once you have returned your graded paper, which I will evaluate for grammar and mechanics as well as for content, once you have received that back, that you incorporate my comments. And if you need further direction, please talk with me and I'll be happy to provide that to you. And then you submit in your revision along with the original graded version with my comments on it, so I can compare and contrast. And then you would get the higher of the two grades. So I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. So you have up until the ending of the semester to submit in that revision, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. Your second paper would be due at the ending of the semester, so you probably wouldn't have time to revise. But the thinking is that you've already learned how to write a paper in the first paper, so you can just incorporate those elements in your second paper. Occasionally, though, I will have a student who will be able to submit in that second paper early enough and negotiate with me, so there's a possibility of a revision, but it's not guaranteed the way it is with the first paper. And if you are reading along in the handout, and you can see that I had put a PDF for you to read for the paper topics, but I've also included it in the text as well in the syllabus and other documents folder in the event that you can't open the PDFs. Much like the syllabus and the course outline, I suggest that you might want to have a printed copy of this in front of you. I'm a dinosaur. I still like printed copies. I have my printed copy right here. And it's talking about both paper number 1 and paper number 2 being critical papers. In other words, I'm not asking you to use outside resources. In fact, I would prefer that you not use outside resources. One of the goals in this class that I have is that you can strengthen your reading and your interpretive skills so that when you are reading a text on your own, you don't have to rely on a teacher or you don't have to rely on your classmates to make a certain level of sense of it. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, we can negotiate. Do understand that it is a more complex exercise because not only are you gathering the research from other scholars, but you also have to include your own additional research. So, that said, I'm thinking the paper would be someplace in the area of about 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins, but as long or short as you think it needs to be to defend your thesis. But 4 to 5 pages is usually the ballpark. And you can choose any of the topics that I've listed or write on your own topic because these are merely suggestions, so feel free to adapt, combine, or dismiss. And I always suggest that if you decide to write on your own topic, or even some of the topics that I provided, you might want to briefly discuss the topic with me. And the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system of documentation, is the system that we use in the humanities, including English classes. I'm hoping this sounds familiar to you, that this was something that you would have talked about in your previous English classes, but I will also be talking about that a little bit more in depth, as well as how to write a paper a little bit more in depth as the semester progresses. Basically, what the MLA system is that it requires you to, after a quote, in quotation marks immediately following that quote, indicate something like the page number for where that quote appears. And usually we have a works cited page at the very ending that lists all of the details of where you found your information. So the titles and the authors and so forth, all listed in alphabetical order. And what you put in the parentheses in the actual paper itself is the least amount of information necessary for an audience to be able to make sense of what it is that you are trying to argue, and for an audience to be able to make sense of where you found that particular information. And sometimes a page number is sufficient. Sometimes you need to add the author's last name along with the page number because you might be referencing multiple authors and it's unclear which author you're talking about. If you've got multiple texts from the same author, sometimes you have to include the name of the text. So again, I'm hopeful that this is something that you talked about in previous English classes, but I will be discussing it with you as well. So, paper number 1, my thinking is that would address the earlier set of readings of the semester. That would be Frankenstein, where we are now, or Persuasion, where we're headed next week. And that paper number 2 would address the later works of the semester. That would be the upcoming Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and or The Awakening. As you know, we began the semester by talking about The Story of an Hour, and The Story of an Hour is indeed a possibility for literary analysis. Just understand that you would be writing about a short story, which is a very different kind of exercise than writing about a novel. And prior to The Story of an Hour, we read The Cult of True Womanhood. It's not a piece of literature, it's a piece of scholarship to try to give us a historical background. But you may want to utilize some of the information in there for a journal or even for a paper. But again, keep in mind that the papers and the journals are supposed to focus on the literary texts themselves. So our first major journal is on Frankenstein. Where I had left you last class was actually watching the film Frankenstein, hoping that might give you a little bit of a chance to catch up with your reading if you hadn't had the opportunity to do that. And you'll see that Regardless of whether or not you decide to write about Frankenstein or Persuasion or any of the upcoming texts, I've deliberately chosen topics that are broad enough that could be applicable in lots of different situations. So you could talk about imagery, for instance, in your paper. And again, you can think about the journal as a kind of draft of a paper if you so wanted to, and address this idea in a journal, but the journals don't have to follow necessarily any kind of conventions. So you don't necessarily even need to use complete sentences. You could use bullet points if you so wanted to. You could talk about one topic or multiple topics that may or may not be related to one another. Obviously, it would be a very different sort of exercise if you were writing a paper. You would need to use sentences and paragraphs, and there would need to be transitions and connections to one central idea, which is your thesis. But if you wanted to talk about imagery, you could isolate a central or particularly meaningful image, such as light and dark imagery, or animal imagery, or food imagery, or as I'll talk about with Frankenstein soon, nature imagery, and discuss one of the novels in terms of that image and what it discloses. Or perhaps you prefer to talk about characters, examine one of the characters in one of the novels and her or his contribution to the novel at large. Probably one of the most frustrating things that you might have found in watching the 1930s film Frankenstein was the switch of the character names, which is why I encourage you to think of the film as basically a separate story than the text that Mary Shelley wrote. However, it's the film that's responsible for making Frankenstein so iconic in our society. Theme. Perhaps you can examine a major theme in one of the novels, such as revenge or suspicion, or trust or death or love, power, justice, just to name a few possibilities. Compare and contrast. You could compare and contrast two characters or two themes, even two novels, but you want to make sure that you're getting a very specific thesis because you're writing only a 4 or 5 page paper that's double spaced with 1-inch margins. So you don't want a topic that's too broad for the confines of this assignment. Or, of course, since we are women in literature class, perhaps you might want to analyze gender. Analyze one or two of the, it says plays, it should say novels, so that was a typo. In terms of gender and power relationships. How are the relationships with, let's say, women and men, or women and women, or men and men presented in the world of the novel? And then at the bottom of this handout, I have a quote that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading somebody else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And you can see immediately after that quote in the parentheses, we have the author's surname, which is Biddle, the page number 9, close parentheses, and the idea is that I would, if this were an academic paper, provide a works cited page that would list that text by Biddle with all of the information that you would need to provide to a bookstore or a library so that you could get a copy of that specific edition so that your page 9 would match up with my page 9 so that you could verify the authenticity of that quote. And you might even notice that in this quote is a square bracket. It's a literary convention that we use, or actually a grammatical convention that we use, stylistic, about how when we're quoting, if we were to insert our own language into a quote, we would put our own language into square brackets. Usually it's done to clarify a pronoun. It might not be clear from the sentence that you've selected. Who the pronoun is referencing. In this instance, I have, or has the author. I wanted to add that in, so I was adding in just a little bit of additional content. Said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, which is a pretty tall order. I had a very wise professor in college say that a paper's never done, you just hand it in at some point. And I think that's quite true. So certainly, while you don't have to begin writing your paper now, I want you to keep it in the back of your mind and let it percolate a bit as we begin to discuss Frankenstein, and that might give you a little bit more clarity about how to proceed with a journal or how to proceed with a paper. book that has never been out of print. So there is something about this story that has captured the imagination of readers in a way that perhaps can't be explained. I had suggested that the 1931 Universal Studios film is a good reason why the text has become so iconic. And if you paid attention to the credits, as I had suggested, you would see that the language used was that the story was based on a novel by Mrs. Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley, of course, being the famous romantic poet, Mary Shelley's partner. But this language almost reminds me of Story of an Hour when we were talking about Mrs. Mallard and the loss of female identity by not referencing the first name, but referencing the surname that becomes the husband's surname. Even the use of Mrs., which denotes marital status, or Miss, which also denotes whether or not female is married or unmarried, in a way that Mr. doesn't. Mr. does not indicate whether or not someone is in relationship, or at least legal relationship, but Miss and Mrs. does. So that said, as I suggested earlier, probably the biggest frustration is keeping the characters straight, Victor and Henry, and the name switch. I suggest that probably the biggest motivator for that name switch was the time period of this film, 1931, and that Victor is a very German-sounding name. And as you know, this was a very tense time politically with Germany. So perhaps not a good idea to have the main character of the film named Victor. Henry being perhaps a safer bet, so to speak. Of course, we see all kinds of changes that were done to the plot. And we see simplifications that were done to the plot as well, because you need to, if nothing else, get into the hour and 15 minutes, sort of the standard running length of Hollywood. So you miss a lot of the nuances of the story. And of course, one of the major questions is what exactly is monstrous? And it's not the creature who is misnamed as the monster, again, in part because of Hollywood, but it's the creator, Victor, for creating something that defies the laws of nature, and also for abandoning his creation. And might I also suggest that humanity itself is monstrous. And if the creature acts in a monstrous way, it's because he's learned through observation and experience from humanity. It's one of the major themes Mary Shelley has in her text. But even that Hollywood film, I think, gives us somewhat of a sympathetic portrayal of the creature. A lot of that has to do with Boris Karloff, who plays the creature, where we get this childlike sense to this creature. And we see how the creature is tormented and with fire and mistreated and abused. And we also see scenes, and they changed this scene from the text. In the film, it's a scene where he befriends a little girl and they begin throwing flower petals into the water. The creature, not understanding the consequences of throwing the girl in the water and the way that they throw flower petals in the water, throws the girl in the water and she drowns. But this was not malicious. This was not intentional. This was accidental, which again shows the idea of a more sympathetic, empathetic creature than perhaps what popular culture has given us with this sense of the creature. Frankenstein, by the way, is not the name of the creature. The creature is never named. It's one of the first responsibilities of parent is to name one's child. And again, Victor negates that responsibility in the Mary Shelley text, and also negates that responsibility as Henry with the name change in the film. Frankenstein is the name of the creator. So the novel title is oftentimes shortened to just Frankenstein, but it continues on, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. So you can see just how schooled Mary Shelley was, and she oftentimes makes literary and academic references, very well read. And Prometheus is from Greek mythology, who was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving that fire to humanity. Think about the parallels with Frankenstein, where Victor Frankenstein is going to be punished by by basically the gods for stealing knowledge that was not for humanity, how to make life from death. And he will be punished accordingly. This idea of hubris, excessive pride, is one that we will oftentimes see in literature, and the consequences of that is punishment. Some of the literary references that you can also see just at the very beginning, because we've got some quotes from Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, if you're not familiar with John Milton, he wrote the great epic poem Paradise Lost, which happens to be about the biblical story of the fall of man, Adam and Eve. That said, if you've ever read the poem, you'll see that it's Satan who basically has the starring role, not Adam, not Eve, and not God. And Satan comes off as a rather sympathetic character. So it's a rather subversive text in that respect, that Satan talks about how he was created to be the most majestic being in the heavens, and then ultimately was ignored by God once God went forth and began creating his new creation, which was humanity. One of the motivations for Satan wanting to destroy humanity. And Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and that's actually the work that I did for my master's thesis, Christopher Marlowe being a contemporary of William Shakespeare's. So he was a dramatist, and he wrote a play, his most famous play, Dr. Faustus. And it's based on a German story, actually. And Dr. Faustus is a scholar, a man of learning who has acquired learning in all of the disciplines, in law and medicine and in theology and so forth. So he's, well, for lack of a better word, bored. And he decides to make a deal with the devil so that he can gain access to knowledge that is not known to man. Spoiler alert here, it's never a good idea to make a deal with the devil. It usually goes bad, which is exactly what happens with Dr. Faustus. So the deal is that he has a certain amount of time on earth where he could use this unlimited knowledge, and then the devil will collect his soul. As the years go by, it turns out that in a lot of ways, Dr. Faustus was tricked by the devil. Many of the pieces of information that Dr. Faustus is given are pieces of information that are already known by humanity, or things that, while they might be amusing, for instance, how to turn yourself invisible, they're really more parlor tricks than anything else. Dr. Faustus turns himself invisible and begins playing pranks on priests, for instance. And throughout the play, Dr. Faustus vacillates between trying to repent and whether or not he should just assume that he's beyond forgiveness. And his rationalization is that, well, God can't forgive my sins because they are so egregious, so I may as well just live it up. Or I've still got time, and if I've still got time, that means I can show forgiveness later and enjoy myself. Well, eventually, Faustus's time is up, and it's only when he's literally being pulled into hell that he decides to repent. Too little, too late at that point. So these two stories are important in terms of our understanding the novel Frankenstein itself. Milton's Paradise Lost, because the creature oftentimes compares himself to Satan, abandoned by its creator, and also to Adam being created, but unlike Adam, not being provided with an Eve, a mate. Also, the creature is, or I should say the creator, that happens to be Victor Frankenstein, is much like Dr. Faustus, punished for seeking knowledge, which is unnatural. Now, that said, the creature in the Hollywood films is rather inarticulate, mostly grunts. There's no dialogue here. Obviously, the creature we're presented with in Mary Shelley's text is much different. Very intelligent, very articulate, and Mary Shelley has to do a little bit of tap dancing to try to explain how such a thing can happen. So there are places in the text where perhaps we have to suspend a lot of disbelief. The idea that the creature just happens to be watching a family that is teaching someone English. Therefore, the creature is able to learn English through its through its eavesdropping. And the fact that one day the creature is in the forest and happens to find a satchel of books. And those books include books such as Milton's Paradise Lost. And of course, they happen to be not only teaching the person to speak English, but to read and write English. So he's able to acquire enough knowledge so that he can actually read Paradise Lost, one of the more difficult texts in the literary tradition. So again, you have to suspend some disbelief. I like to joke that this is what my students should do the next time they need to buy books for a class. Just wander in the forest. Perhaps you'll find a satchel with your chemistry textbook. But somehow I suspect that won't be the case. That said, the probably more surprising element of Frankenstein when you're reading the text is just how different the construction of the text is. That it is told through a series of letters. This is a convention that's known as the epistolary novel. It was very common during the time period that Mary Shelley was writing. I can almost think of perhaps the way that we use social media today to communicate in the way that letters would have been used to communicate with individuals during that time. But the epistolary novel technique, in addition to being a convention of the time, also leads to questions of narration, specifically the reliability of the narrator. Ultimately, and it's easy to forget this as we're reading the text, we hear from one character and only one character, and that happens to be Walton, who, through letters to his sister, is giving her the story of Frankenstein. Now, when he gives us the story of Victor Frankenstein and also the story of the creature through Victor Frankenstein, he uses the I for the information he would have been given, but that's why it's easy for us to forget that it's Walton who's narrating the entire thing. But we never get any direct information from Victor, nor do we get any direct information from the creature. And we know that this morality tale, because it is a morality tale, it's trying to teach us something, is a tale in which we learn that ambition and hubris are negative things that we should try to avoid. And some of the consequences of that are that individuals become isolated and lonely, which is what Walton is at the beginning when he talks about that he really has no friend on the crew, that he's lonely and by himself, and he's not in a good state physically, he's not in a good state emotionally, which means that we have to question how accurate his letter writing is, especially because he says that he comes across Victor and brings him on the seas and brings him aboard his ship, and then Victor narrates the story to him, and then it's only hours later at the ending of the day that he puts the story to pen and paper. You can imagine the kinds of possibilities of errors just with the time lapse, let alone with being fatigued and being emotionally distraught, which is the situation Walton's in. So sometimes it's brought forth that perhaps the entire tale is a figment of Walton's imagination, an example of his subconscious about the role of ambition and hubris. And that could certainly be the case. It's not as interesting of a reading as to think of Victor as actually existing. But keep this in mind, because we're getting tale within tale embedded within itself. So Walton is basically giving us Victor's tale, but Victor is basically giving us the creature's tale. And Victor is very similar to Walton, and Walton's very similar to Victor. It's one of the reasons why Mary Shelley provides us with both of these characters. In other words, we have to wonder if it does turn out that we can trust Walton, and already we've established that in many ways he's quite unreliable. Can we really trust Victor? Because Victor is also in a bad place physically and also in a bad place emotionally. And could the creature be a figment of Victor's imagination? And yes, I know that by the ending of the novel that Walton sees the creature, but a hallucination wouldn't at all be out of the question, considering the situation of being basically adrift at sea for long periods of time. So I give you that as one of the more interesting things that Mary Shelley does with her novel about complicating narration, something that of course we don't see in the Hollywood film because it wants to give us a simple narrative. where we're given central male characters. And again, that might be surprising for a women in literature class where we've got a female author writing. Might I argue that this is perhaps a commentary on the male-centric world, that what happens when female is excluded? Bad things. That's the feminist commentary here. If there had been the balancing nature of female there, then Victor would not have been running amok. It was something that we talked a little bit about in the Cult of True Womanhood, this idea that women were somewhat responsible for men's morality. They were talking about it in terms of sexuality, not necessarily in terms of ambition, but same principle. I would also suggest that we do have a star female character in this novel, and it's Nature, who's usually referenced as female, Mother Nature. That these long nature passages that scholars believe that Mary Shelley inserted in part because of Percy Shelley's insistence are more than just conventions and more than just celebrations of the natural world, which was something that the Romantic poets were well known for doing in their writing. But it was also a way to show the stabilizing force of nature. Notice how Victor is usually in a much better physical and emotional state when he's in nature. It's only when he isolates himself from nature that he ends up suffering. And we see the consequences of that through his hubris and ambition. So, as we continue on, one of the things I wanted you to think about was mothers. I didn't plan the class this way, but one of the things that we will notice as the semester progresses is that we have lots of motherless characters. That perhaps indicates the central importance of mother and female in the world. And that, I think, is very much illustrated with something like the adoption of Elizabeth, who becomes Victor's kind of cousin, not blood cousin, but he thinks of her as cousin or almost like sister. But because they aren't related by blood, the assumption is that they will have an arranged marriage. Not very unusual during that time period to have arranged marriages, especially for the upper classes to have arranged marriages within their own families, because they wanted to maintain birthright, they wanted to maintain economic inheritance, they wanted to maintain sometimes social status, or all of the above. We'll definitely see this when we read Persuasion. But not only is Elizabeth motherless, but Victor becomes motherless through the loss of his mother, who dies. And one could argue this is Victor's motivation for trying to create life from death after the death of his mother, that he's so distraught that he wants to basically defy the natural order. And because we're defined a natural order, we oftentimes talk about Frankenstein in the context of horror or Gothic, and I certainly do in my Gothic literature class. There are some occult references in this text. If you know anything about the Philosopher's Stone, perhaps you're familiar with it through Harry Potter, that this stone was supposed to provide everlasting life. Or you might have heard the name Cornelius Agrippa, who was a very famous occultist. So basically, Victor is playing with occultism, as well as with science, which is why this text is oftentimes read in the context of science fiction classes as well. Though there are also lots of Gothic elements associated with the text, and the Gothic usually will show things like dark and dreary atmosphere. Think about the creation scene, which comes rather late in the novel, in chapter 5 actually, which is rather surprising. Again, usually people think that it's much earlier in the story. And death and decay. I mean, Victor is really going to charnel houses and picking up the body parts of corpses. So, of course, the movie tries to provide some sort of an explanation as to why this creature is, quote, bad, by saying he has an abnormal brain. If you've never seen Young Frankenstein, I encourage you to do it. Abnormal is one of the great in-jokes there that, again, you'd have to see the the film in order to understand it. Of course, there's nothing of that nature in Mary Shelley's text. There is nothing abnormal about this creature, but there is abnormality in the way the creature is created, and perhaps abnormality in Victor's hubris and ambition. I've oftentimes said that Frankenstein should be required reading for all science majors. A couple classes ago, I had talked about the idea of artificial intelligence, or as is stated so eloquently in Jurassic Park, because I am a media and popular culture teacher as well. Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. And not thinking through the consequences of scientific discovery has more often than not led to a lot of heartache. Just ask the creators of the atomic bomb, who after their creation said that if they had truly understood what they were doing, they never would have done it. But there's no going back. And I certainly hope that we don't end up in that place with artificial intelligence, but I must admit, I am concerned. But as we move forward, and I'm looking at the time, I'm cognizant of the time as well. I know we're not going to finish Frankenstein today. You can see that I've got an overview there of some of the more important elements of the text. What I thought I would do is talk about a few of them today, and then finish them up next class, and then give some quotations, and then we can move forward and start talking about writing papers and talk about reading persuasion as well. So my hope is that at this point you are beginning to read Persuasion. I warn you right now, it is a very slow and dense read, deliberately so, because it is trying to mimic the lifestyle of the very rich and the very privileged of society. And that said, you can see that they have lots of empty hours on their hands, lots of leisure. So doing something like taking a walk is quite exciting, because you get out of the house and you can perhaps meet new people. And your existence mostly is about throwing parties and trying to show off to family and friends, which is one of the major elements of conflict at the beginning of the novel. Is that what happens when you no longer have the dollars to afford that lifestyle, even though you still have the family name and the expectation that you would have for that lifestyle. So keep that in mind, that we're not supposed to like these characters. And if you've ever wanted to take a sneak peek as to how the rich live, I haven't seen the television show Succession, but I've read about it, and about a very wealthy family, and it was quite popular. So this will give you an idea of wealth during the 1800s in England. And it's probably our slowest read, again, trying to mimic the pace of that lifestyle. When we get to our next text, which is Jane Eyre, it's a longer text, but it moves much more quickly, because we're dealing with a different class of people, or a different class of person, I should say, within Jane Eyre. But going back to the overview for Frankenstein, and the first letter to Mrs. Saville, Walton's sister Margaret. Again, the importance of that idea of Mrs., that she's lost that individual identity, even with her own brother. In letter 1, Walton says, I prefer glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. Of course, that's one of the moral elements of this tale, is that he shouldn't have done that. It's something that Victor does. Again, there are lots of parallels between Victor and Walton, and there are consequences because of that. In letter 2, Walton says, I have no friend, in part because he's basically decided to abandon society so that he could pursue his ambition. Of course, those are one of the many negative consequences that occur, not just to Walton, but also to Victor. Notice how he increasingly isolates himself as he continues to work on his creation. And Walton talks about the unvisited regions he's about to explore, and he's looking from a geographical perspective in terms of discovery. But of course, Victor is also traveling unvisited regions, but those are more intellectual and perhaps spiritual. In letter 3, Walton says, what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? And again, I suggest that maybe something should, when we think about some of the negative consequences that could be associated with scientific discovery. Not to say that scientific discovery doesn't come with positive consequences. Mary Shelley would have never known about something like cloning or artificial insemination, but those topics work so nicely in terms of some of the themes that we will see with Victor creating life from death. Letter 4 with Walton, and he talks about how he comes across Victor, who's basically floating out at sea. And he saves Victor, brings him aboard his ship, and says that Victor was not, as the other traveler seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. So as progressive as Mary Shelley might be in terms of some of her statements about gender and some of her statements about appearance, the creature is rejected ultimately because of its hideous appearance, which is perhaps one of the reasons why some of the great social ills in our society exist, or racism and classism and sexism. It's about superficialities. But when we see here that Walton is very clear that he is Eurocentric, it's in part because Mary Shelley herself is Eurocentric. We also see a Christian bias in this text as well, as we will see as the text progresses. In letter 4, Victor is telling Walton, this is supposed to be kind of cautionary tale. I sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Unhappy man, do you share my madness? And this is supposed to set up the frame for the rest of the story, that Victor is going to tell the story of the negative consequences of what he did so that Walton doesn't follow suit. And Walton says, or I should say Victor says that, he was a slave of passion, and we see this over and over again, this idea of mastery and servitude and no longer being in control of one's emotions. Now, when we get to chapter 1 is finally when we get to Victor's story. This seems to be a nice break that I could have. I'm going to keep the notes for the entire text here, but I'm going to be discussing next class, starting from chapter 1, which is Victor's story, some of the ironies in his story, as he says that, he was well loved by his parents. And we have to wonder, well, if his parents loved him so well, why doesn't he love his own creation? And as we continue on, we'll see how ultimately it's Victor and humanity as a whole that is the true monstrosity, and not the creature. And that the creature shows not only intelligence, and the creature shows not only empathy and concern for others, but I think the creature shows a certain level of superiority, considering the way that it's been treated and the way that it continues to be treated. So that's not to in any way excuse some of its behavior as the novel progresses. It almost reminds me of the very difficult dynamic that might exist between parent and child when parent has not lived up to parent's responsibility to child. So we can't blame child, but ultimately, child needs to take responsibility for its own actions at some point, especially when child becomes adult. And how do you balance those two things? It's something that we struggle with in society, and certainly we will see in the text as well. So what's left is our attendance question, which will be due on Saturday the 3rd at 9 a.m. Though certainly if you need an extension, just ask me. I'd be happy to grant it to you. That today's attendance question, and you should be able to answer it even if you haven't necessarily finished the novel in its entirety. Did you like or dislike Mary Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique, and why? Did you like it or dislike the epistolary novel technique, and why? Again, no right or wrong answer. I like to ask questions that aren't factually based, but questions more that will show reasoning and contemplation. And while you're not required to read the response, or you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. That would give you an idea of what we would be doing if we were meeting live or in the second half of the class discussion. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, starting with Chapter 1 with Victor's story, putting closure onto Frankenstein. Again, if you wanted to wait to submit in your journal until Tuesday, that's perfectly fine. And then we'll start Persuasion and talk a little bit about writing papers. Take care. Bye-bye.